The house that shouldn't exist. The first thing they noticed was how wrong the air felt. Not just heavy, not just damp, but wrong. As if the trees themselves had been holding their breath for decades, waiting for someone foolish enough to trespass. Clay's boots sank into the moss with a sucking sound as he followed the surveyor's path up the hollow. The forest was so quiet that he could hear his own pulse in his ears. No birds, no wind, no hum of insects. Just the sound of breath, his and something else's, faint and slow, behind the boards of the house ahead. It stood half swallowed by the hillside. Shingled roof slick with black moss, its outline warped but defiant. There was no road, no fence, no mailbox. Only a front porch sagging like a jaw in mid-scream. The windows were boarded from the inside. The gaps filled with pitch so thick that no light escaped. Someone had wanted this house dark. Someone had wanted it forgotten. And yet here it was, waiting. Clay was not supposed to be here. The county had sent him to chart flood risk, not to go wandering into forgotten land grants. But the topo maps had shown a suspicious rise, unnaturally geometric. And Clay was not the sort of man who ignored questions that kept him awake at night. He had walked nearly 3 miles off course just to find this place, following the curve of a dry creek bed until the air changed, until his breath began to fog though the morning was warm. Now standing on the porch, he felt like he'd found not a house but a grave. He reached out and touched the door. It was sealed with iron spikes driven straight through the wood into the threshold. The metal was orange with rust but cold, so cold that it burned. There were no footprints, no sign of approach. Even the weeds at the edge of the porch stopped short, as if unwilling to grow too near. Clay's compass needle spun lazily in circles, refusing to settle on north. Inside, something shifted. Not loud. Just a faint scrape, like nails dragged along the floorboards. The county lodge was quiet that night when Clay filed his report. His partner, an older man who had refused to climb the hollow with him, snorted when Clay mentioned the house. "You didn't see a house," the man said flatly, not looking up from his coffee. "Ain't been a dwelling up that way since before my daddy's time. You saw a shack, some hunter's blind, maybe an old still." "It wasn't a shack," Clay said. "It was—" He hesitated, searching for words, then gave up and just wrote it down. Unmapped. Spiked shut. Cold. He underlined the last word twice. Weeks passed before anyone cared about Clay's report. Then a second team was sent. Not surveyors this time, but the State Historic Preservation Office. They brought with them 2 sheriff's deputies and a crowbar. When they pried the door open, the air that poured out was so stale it tasted metallic. The house had been sealed for decades, maybe longer, and yet it smelled of neither mold nor rot, only of something still, too still to be natural. Inside were 11 narrow beds. Iron frames, mattresses stripped to ticking. A child's chair was bolted to the floor beside the fireplace, its tray warped and darkened. The hearth had never seen flame. The mirrors were gone, their nails wrenched from the walls with such force that the wood still bore scars. And in the master bedroom, behind a dresser that took 4 men to move, was a false panel held with pitch and strips of hide. When they pried it free, they found a single volume wrapped in linen, sealed in wax, heavier than it should have been. No title, no date. The first page was written backward. When Clay returned home that night, he could not stop thinking about the sound he'd heard. The scrape behind the boards. He told himself it was nothing. A rat maybe, or the house shifting. But when he dreamed of children sitting back to back in a windowless room, writing with their left hands in perfect unison, though none made a sound, and somewhere in the dark, something smiled too soon. The doctrine of still blood. The journal was not opened in the field. No one wanted to be the first to touch it barehanded. Even wrapped in its linen shroud, the book felt wrong. Not cursed, not humming with some gothic energy, just too present, like an object that knew it was being looked at. Clay watched from the corner of the county lodge's common room as the preservation office catalogued their find. Their voices were low, clipped as if speaking too loudly might wake something. The wax on the book's edges had blackened and flaked, clinging to the cloth like rot. When one of the deputies tried to lift it, he grunted, not because it was heavy, but because it seemed to resist, as though it didn't want to move. No one could agree who should break the seal. So they didn't, not that night. The book was packed into a steel case and driven away under guard before dawn. But Clay couldn't stop thinking about it, because the sound had come back. He woke before sunrise, drenched in cold sweat. Sure, he had heard the scrape again. Not outside this time, but inside the walls of his motel room. It faded as soon as he opened his eyes, leaving only silence and the taste of iron in his mouth. In the bathroom mirror, his reflection seemed a second late. A week later, the journal was officially designated as archival material of uncertain provenance and sent to the State Records Facility in Frankfurt for controlled examination. Clay wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that process. He was a low-level surveyor who had stumbled on something meant to stay buried. But the department's director had grown quietly uneasy and, perhaps out of superstition, requested that the man who found the house be present for context. Clay didn't correct her when she called him the finder. The word stuck like a splinter. The State Records building was all marble hush and fluorescent hum. They led him to a sub-basement where the air was so dry his throat ached after a few breaths. The journal waited beneath a cone of sterile light. Its wax cracked open now, its pages fanned like dry tongues. A forensic linguist named Mercer stood over it with gloved hands, muttering to herself. At first glance, the writing looked illegible, cramped curls and hooks scattered like insects. Then Mercer angled a mirror against the page. The lines sprang to life in reverse, crawling right to left in perfect mirrored script. Human blood, she said matter-of-factly, as though announcing the time. At least 3 donors. Age degradation puts the earliest entries around 1920, possibly earlier. Names? Clay asked. His voice sounded too loud. None, Mercer said. Just initials. Over and over, MRL, and this. She pointed at a looping glyph that appeared at the beginning and end of every section. 2 parallel L's scrolled together until they formed a kind of spiral. They called it the line, Mercer whispered. Over 40 years, and never once did it bend. The entries were not stories. They were rules. No mention of seasons, no talk of crops or visitors. Just anatomical descriptions. Narrow hips, straight teeth, eye alignment measured to the millimeter. Birth logs reduced to equations. No mothers named. No fathers listed. One entry from 1924 read, LL plus LL yields second form. No stammer. No deviation in breath. In the margin, a note in smaller hand. Narrow is strong, Clay. Felt something cold coil up behind his ribs. Another passage described a child who sang before sleep as unripe. A second who refused boiled root was marked excised. There was no indication what excision meant, only that the next line described a new birth as corrected. Mercer's voice grew quieter as she read. They weren't trying to grow, she murmured. They were trying to erase variance. As they turned the brittle pages, the handwriting grew tighter, sharper, yet somehow more erratic, as if written by a hand that no longer belonged to flesh. The later entries abandoned even the pretense of names or ages. Births were listed as held longer inside, mirrored complete, well over previous. By the 1940s, the tone was almost mechanical. There was no concept of children anymore. Only reflections. Clay found himself staring not at the words, but at the shapes between them. The blank spaces seemed too deliberate, too symmetrical. He swore they formed faint outlines of faces, thin and elongated, eyes set too wide apart. Then the shapes blinked. He jerked back, chair legs screeching. Mercer looked up sharply. What? Nothing, Clay said too quickly, but his pulse was hammering, because for half a second, he was certain the page had looked back. That night, Clay dreamed of the house again, only this time it was hollow, scooped out from within like the shell of some colossal insect. The rooms curved inward, spiraling, every hallway narrowing until he crawled on hands and knees, following the sound of children whispering in a language that reversed itself halfway through each word. At the center of the spiral waited a mirror, black as pitch. He looked into it and saw nothing, no reflection, no him. When Clay returned to the records facility the next day, Mercer was gone. Her workstation sat neatly arranged, gloves folded, pen aligned perfectly parallel to the page she'd left open. The page contained only one line written backward. The left-handed ones can't be taught. Burn their names. The archivist on duty said Mercer had requested emergency leave during the night. She hadn't said why. Clay should have walked away then. He should have gone back to charting rivers and forgotten the house. But the journal wasn't finished with him. because on the last page she had touched, in the faintest graphite, barely visible under the overhead light, was a small, looping scrawl, his own initials CL written backward. The shape. Beneath the names, Clay did not remember driving back to Pine Hollow. He remembered leaving the State Records building under the antiseptic glare of its lights. He remembered his hands trembling so badly he dropped his car keys twice. And then, nothing. Just the road unspooling like a tongue in the dark. The radio dead. The trees leaning too far inward. When he blinked, the house was in front of him again. It stood exactly as before. Sagging roofline. Boards nailed over its eyes. The front door clenched with iron spikes. Only the forest had changed. The trees stood farther back, as if the house had exhaled during his absence and the woods had flinched. Clay sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling and an animal part of his brain screaming, "Go." But another part, colder, quieter, whispered that he had never really left, that he had been orbiting this place for weeks, maybe years, maybe all his life. And then he saw the child. Just for an instant. Watching from the attic window, its face was too pale, too symmetrical, like a mask carved from candle wax. It didn't move, but the curtain twitched behind it as if something had just withdrawn. He slammed his eyes shut. Counted to 5. Opened them again. The window was empty. Inside, the air was still as old water. Dust floated in rigid lines, unmoving even when he passed through them. It was like the house had stopped breathing decades ago and the air hadn't realized yet. He found the master bedroom where the journal had been buried. The dresser still stood pushed back from the wall, the false panel gaping like a toothless mouth. The cavity was empty now, but the smell remained. Not rot, not mold, something drier, like old iron ground into cloth. But there was something else. Something new. Scattered across the floor were sheets of thin, yellowed paper. They hadn't been here before. He was certain of it. Each sheet bore a faint anatomical sketch drawn in brown-black ink so faded it almost blended with the stains in the wood. At first they seemed like ordinary medical diagrams. Measurements annotated each figure, skull circumference, shoulder width, femur length. But the proportions were wrong. The craniums were too narrow, the limbs too long, tapering like roots. One sketch labeled "good spine" showed vertebrae arched so steeply they nearly formed a circle. Another showed a hand, but the fingers were fused together, a smooth paddle of flesh. In the margin, no cut. Held form. Clay's mouth went dry. These weren't children. They were attempts. He found dozens of these sketches, heads, torsos, profiles of jaws. In the earlier drawings, the faces were almost human, just slightly uncanny in their symmetry. But as the pages went on, the features dissolved. The ears vanished. The eyes widened and then blurred. One figure had no mouth at all, just smooth skin where the lower half of the face should be. Beneath it, scrawled backward. Spoke too soon. The handwriting was neat, precise, but the paper trembled as he held it, not from his hands shaking, but from something faint and rhythmic, as if the drawings themselves had heartbeats. A sudden creak split the silence. Clay spun, heart lurching. The sound had come from above, the attic. The staircase was warped with age, boards bowing under his weight, each groan of the wood stretching far too long, like something was echoing his steps a beat late. At the top of the stairs, the hallway yawned ahead, narrower than he remembered. He passed the rooms like museum exhibits preserved in decay. Iron bed frames stripped bare, bowls stacked like offerings, walls smeared with sootless handprints, and then he reached the end of the hall. The nailed door. 4 iron spikes crisscrossed the frame. Rust had swollen them, blooming out like tumors from the wood. Clay stood staring, certain he could hear something behind it. Not movement, not breathing, something subtler, like fabric brushing against itself in a slow, endless rhythm. He pried at the nails. They came loose too easily, crumbling as if hollow. The last spike dropped with a clatter that sounded far too loud for the silence around it. Clay swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room was small. Low ceiling, walls bowed inward as though the house was trying to close its fist around it. 3 beds were lined up against the wall. They were smaller than cots, crookedly hand-built, with iron fixtures at the corners still holding the remnants of short chains and heavy buckles. Beneath the center bed, A dark bloom spread across the floorboards in a perfect semicircle. It was dry now, but it had seeped deep into the grain. Blood, old human, and in the stillness of that room, it was somehow fresh. One wall was slashed in dozens of vertical gouges, deep and shallow, wild but deliberate, like someone had tried to claw their way out or carve their way in. The opposite wall bore nothing, except a crooked line of twine, nailed from corner to corner. 5 yellowed cards dangled from it. Each bore a single, mirrored letter scrawled in charcoal. Clay angled his flashlights. TILL. Something scuttled behind him. He turned. Nothing. But the bed closest to him had shifted an inch toward the center of the room. Clay backed out slowly, never turning his back, down the hall, down the stairs, out into the night air that felt like breaking a surface after drowning. He staggered to the car, shaking, gasping, whispering still under his breath like a charm to keep his mind from cracking. But as he jammed the key into the ignition, he froze, because the rearview mirror showed the house behind him. And in the attic window, the window of the room he had just left, there were 3 figures, small, motionless, all the same face, his face. The mouth that spoke before him, Clay did not drive away that night. He told himself he had. He even dreamt the hum of the highway, the warm sodium haze of distant town lights, the buzz of a motel TV left on to keep the dark from settling. But when he woke, his cheek was pressed to splintered floorboards, and the taste of the house was in his mouth like rusted nails dissolved on his tongue. He was back inside. The front door was bolted from the inside again, a plank of rust-bitten iron spanning its width, 5 nails driven clean through as if they'd never been pulled. His car was gone, not stolen, not driven, just not there. Where the dirt road should have stretched away into the trees was only bramble, pale, brittle stalks of thorn and dogwood woven together like scar tissue, closing the world behind him. At first he tried to scream, not out of panic, though panic clawed at his ribs, but simply to prove to himself that he still had a voice. The sound never left his throat. It wasn't that he'd lost it. It was that something else caught it, as if the house had no air for sound to travel through. Silence in Pine Hollow wasn't absence. It was pressure. He wandered. Hours, maybe days. Rooms warped as he passed them, the corridors curling, contracting. A hallway that had once held 5 doors now held only 3, and one of those was a window. He tried marking his path with scratches in the walls. They disappeared when he looked away. He tried leaving the doors open. They closed themselves while he blinked. Eventually, he stopped trying to navigate. Instead, he listened, and that was worse, because the house had begun whispering, not words, at least not at first, but the shape of words. Dry syllables forming against the grain of the wood like teeth clenching slowly in their sleep. Then one night, crouched in what had once been the kitchen, Clay heard it speak his name, perfectly, twice. Once just ahead of him, and once behind. The voice didn't echo. It pre-echoed, as if the house said it before he could. He found the child's slate in the hearth 2 nights later. A blackboard barely the width of his palm, its surface scratched with lines that looked like nonsense until he caught their reflection in a shard of glass. The mirrored alphabet, written flawlessly in a child's hand, and beneath it, in backward script, "You are the new." His own name followed. Perfectly formed, already there before he could react, Clay snapped the slate in half. The chalk lines bled, not metaphorically. Dark beads welled along the breaks like sap from a cut tree. The pieces twitched in his hands as if trying to crawl back together. He fled up the stairs. The attic called to him like a pulse behind plaster, but when he reached the end of the hall, the nailed door stood open. Inside, the 3 small beds had shifted again. They now stood in a perfect triangle, and on each mattress, drawn in dust too fine to have settled naturally, was a word. Him something stepped out of the corner. It was his shape, his posture, his gait, but not his face. Its skin was pale and too smooth, as though erased and redrawn too many times. Its mouth was only a slit, but when it opened, it spoke in his voice, not echoing him but anticipating him, syllables falling into the air a heartbeat before he thought them. "I will remember you," it said, "until you do." And then it smiled. "A fraction too early," Clay screamed. This time the sound left his throat, but the thing's lips moved with it as if it had been waiting to speak his scream for him. The boards beneath his feet snapped like dry twigs. He plunged through the attic floor, through the second-story ceiling down into blackness, landing amid cold earth and something that yielded like flesh then crumbled like paper. He lay stunned in the dark, gasping, and his hands brushed shapes in the soil, long and thin, coiled like roots but warm with the memory of blood. A faint glow bled through the dirt around him, lines looping and mirrored, carved into the soil like veins. Letters they spelled one word, over and over, in backward script that glimmered like the afterimage of lightning. Return. And from deeper in the dark something whispered it with his mouth. Before he did. The mirror remembers Clay woke with soil in his mouth, cold, gritty, tasteless. It felt like chewing a word he couldn't pronounce. He spat, or tried to. The earth clung to his tongue like wet paper, then dissolved, leaving his teeth buzzing with a low hum, like distant wires under frost, and then softly, from nowhere, good, he can speak without the mouth. The voice wasn't outside. It was inside the shape of his thoughts, slipping between them like water into cracks. He sat up fast, heart hammering. The cellar around him was gone. No walls. No ceiling. Only the black shifting like smoke around a stone dropped in ink. He stood and the ground rose with him. A ripple, a pulse. As if he wasn't standing on the house anymore, but in it. Or worse. As if the house was standing in him. In front of him hung the journal. Not lying on the ground. Not placed on a shelf, just hanging, weightless, turning slowly in air that didn't move. Its pages fluttered without wind, each leaf stopping just long enough for him to glimpse shapes. Hands without fingers. Faces without mouths. Birth records signed with his own initials. He tried to run. His body didn't move. No, worse. It moved, but later. Like a delayed reflection. His arm rose seconds after he willed it. His legs followed commands he hadn't given yet. He reached for the journal and it reached back. The pages slapped open with a wet sound. Text bled across them in mirrored script that shimmered as if seen underwater. He couldn't read it, until he stopped trying to. Then the meaning arrived before the words. We do not name you. The name arrives. Something clicked in his head. A quiet realignment like bones sliding into the wrong sockets with terrible relief. He understood it all. Too quickly. Too easily. The journal wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be remembered. Not passed down by story, but by occupation. Each mind a room. Each name a door. And he had just unlocked his. When he blinked, he was 6 years old. His hands were small. He was sitting in a row of other children, back to back, scratching mirrored letters into slates as dust rose like breath around them. They did not look at him, but their spines shifted as one when he exhaled. Then he blinked again, and he was 43, kneeling in the attic of a house no longer decaying, the boards slick as fresh skin, watching a version of himself crawl out of the wall like a newborn pulled from paper. It smiled too soon. They all did. He screamed, and the sound came out backward. When he collapsed, panting on the cellar floor, the journal lay open on his chest. The mirrored text blurred, dissolved and reformed in his own handwriting. His looping scrawl, the one he used to write shopping lists and apology notes, now flowing flawlessly right to left. Entry after entry filled itself in as he watched. CL+, CL yields alignment. Voice repeats without prompt. Spine holds, teeth even. Returned, returned, returned. He tried to throw the journal away. His hands wouldn't obey. They just kept writing. Lines formed across the margins without ink, like bruises blooming through the paper. Then a sentence burned across the top of the page, each letter appearing before the last. If you stop, you end. Clay sobbed. Not out of fear anymore. Out of something worse, recognition, because he remembered this. Not just the house. Not just the doctrine. He remembered being here before. Kneeling where he was kneeling now. Writing what he was writing now, watching another man sob exactly as he was sobbing now. The same posture. The same words. The same voice, his own. He clawed at the walls. They gave like damp paper, then hardened like bone. Scratches appeared in mirrored pairs as if the wall had expected them. He found an old handprint there, too small to be his, until it fit him perfectly. In the corner of the room, something unfolded from itself. It wore his shape. His eyes, but its skin was translucent like thin milk over a mirror. It held a slate in its hand. His name was written on it backward, and underneath a new word forming in real time as the chalk scraped silently. Again, the thing smiled. Perfectly timed now. Not too soon. Not too late, correct, and then it said, "You remembered. So you are." Clay felt his mind buckle. Like a mirror dropped inward instead of outward. Dozens of versions of himself stood around him now, ages stacked like concentric rings on a tree, all writing the same lines, all in mirrored script, all whispering in one voice. We were not born new. We were returned. We were returned. We were returned. Then silence, and only Clay left, or maybe the one who used to be Clay. He opened the journal one last time. A single sentence glowed across the page, written both forward and backward at once so that it could be read no matter which way the eye turned. Tomorrow, you will not remember arriving. The ink sank into the paper like water into dry earth, and the book closed itself. Somewhere above, faintly, boards creaked, not with footsteps, with pre-steps. The last clean one, Clay, woke on the front porch. Dawn, or something like it, hung over Pine Hollow like frost suspended mid-fall. The trees stood still as gravestones. No wind, no birds, not even the thin whine of insects, and the house behind him was whole, perfect, fresh timber, clean glass, not a single nail out of place, like it had just been built for him. He staggered to his feet, barefoot, shirt stiff with dried soil. His chest rose too smoothly, like breath had become a reflex he no longer owned. Down the slope, the valley stretched pale and empty, the creek bed gone dry, roots exposed like gray veins. He thought of running, but his legs didn't move. They simply turned him back toward the door, and that's when he saw them. Children. 11 of them. Standing silently across the yard in 2 perfect rows. Barefoot in the frost, eyes wide, pupils like dull coins. Their faces were identical. His face, each child carried a small slate. On every slate, one word was written backward in perfect symmetry. Returned. Clay's mouth went dry. He croaked. But the sound wasn't his. It came from all of them at once, 11 voices whispering in flawless unison. You were not chosen to escape. You were chosen to complete. The ground buckled. Not a quake. A pulse. The house's shadow stretched out across the yard, longer, wider, folding over itself like wet fabric. Boards rippled like muscle. Windows dilated. The entire structure shivered as if drawing a breath. Clay ran, or he thought he did. His body blurred, footsteps hollow as drum beats inside bone. The valley spun backward, sky turning like a spool. And suddenly he was in the kitchen. The hearth yawned open, black and slick, a draftless wind exhaling from inside it, carrying the smell of dry milk teeth. On the stone floor, 11 shadows. No children now, just shadows waiting for his to join. Something heavy swung in the air above him. The journal. Its cover throbbed with a heartbeat not his own. Pages cracked open like jaws. Seal the memory. Seal the blood. Seal the house. The words carved themselves into the air, glowing like hot wire, and beneath them, one last line scrawled in frantic mirrored script. One will be the seal. He screamed, "No!" and hurled the book into the hearth. It didn't burn. It opened wider, splitting like an egg. Inside, not paper, a face. His own. Pale and unfinished, eyes closed like it was waiting to be put on. The house moaned. Floorboards curled inward. The hearth drew breath like a throat. Behind him, the children stepped forward. Their shadows merged across the floor until only one remained, and Clay was standing in it. No, he was it. The journal rose into his hands without touch. Pages fanned open on their own. Ink bled up from the paper, climbing his wrist like vines, etching words into his skin. L plus LEL yields line complete. No deviation, no escape, seal. He felt his name fall off him, like a leaf, like something never real. Memories shivered, peeled away. His truck, his sister's voice, the color of the sky outside this valley. All gone, dissolving like chalk in water. What remained was the house, and its hunger and its need to keep breathing. The children stopped moving. They stood in a wide circle, heads tilted back, Mouths opening for the first time. From each one came a single sound. Not a word. Not even speech. A note. Thin. High. Glass sharp. The sound lifted the nails from the walls. It cracked the pitch from the glass. It unlatched the doors from inside. The house exhaled. Clay fell to his knees, screaming as the journal fused into his chest like a closing wound. And suddenly he understood. He had not found the house. The house had found its next wall. When he opened his eyes, there were no children. No yard, no sky, just rooms. Endless, immaculate rooms, walls gleaming like marrow. And in each one, a version of himself sat quietly writing. Mirrored script bloomed across their pages in unison. Not from ink, but from memory. His memory. Their memory. One memory. Somewhere. Far away, he thought he heard a highway. Then it folded shut like paper. He looked down at his hands. The ink was gone. In its place, his skin had smoothed like fresh plaster. And when he stood, his footsteps made no sound. Because he wasn't walking on the floor anymore, he was the floor. Outside, years passed. The forest closed around Pine Hollow again. The porch rotted. The glass blackened. And when surveyors returned decades later, they found the house exactly as before. Silent, sealed, waiting. No journal. No bodies. Just 11 narrow beds and a child's chair bolted to the hearth. No one noticed the walls, how warm they felt, how they seemed to breathe. If you drive the old service road into the valley now, just past the dry creek you might see it. A sagging shape in the trees, tilted like it's listening. They say if you knock, you'll hear the knock come back a heartbeat too late. Like an echo. Like someone deciding if you're close enough to copy. And if you stay long enough, if you listen close through the boards, you might hear someone whisper from behind the plaster, "Tomorrow you will not remember arriving."